India and China, two giant populations, two giant economies, two ancient civilizations. The question of which of them will take the lead in Asia's future has been asked more and more loudly in recent years. When we ask, why does India want to finish off China? We are using a simplified phrase, because in New Delhi's eyes, it would be unfair to define it simply as taking down Beijing. But nonetheless, the great competition between India's rise and China's global weight is forcing the two countries to actually face each other. At the root of the issue lie territorial disputes, economic conflicts of interest, military balances of power, and the Asian order that will define the next generation. So, there are many answers to the question of why India wants to rein in China. Border tensions, competition for population and defense power, economic conflicts, desire for regional leadership. It is worth analyzing all of them step by step. How did India and China come to be so aggressive with each other?
It's 45 years since the last deadly clash between India and China on this border. 45 years. So what changed?
And both China and India officials are calling for de-escalation.
For a long time, both countries were perceived as huge societies that seemed close to the spirit of the non-aligned movement, trying to build their own development models in opposition to the West. But in a twist of history, as both grew in size and power, so did the issues between them. In the shadow of the war between Russia and Ukraine, China is seen as one of the most important threats to the West and the United States. In fact, the US in particular feels that China's political and military strategies should be prioritized over those of Russia and North Korea. Underlying this concern, of course, is China's enormous contribution to the combined Russian and North Korean pacification of first Ukraine and then Japan and South Korea. According to war strategists, the Chinese wing wants to use Russia and North Korea in an operational sense, and then to assert its real dominance in Europe and the Pacific. This is indeed an international risk factor that requires attention. The US is not the only party feeling China's discomfort. India, with the seventh largest geographical area and the largest population in the world, perceives China as a growing threat, just like the US. The most important problem between the two countries is the border dispute. The deadly clash on the India-China border has caused a fundamental change in the relations between the two Asian giants. Concerns over competition for influence in South Asia and globally have spilled over into border disputes, fueling military build-ups and increasing the risk of new conflicts. Nationalist governments in both countries have not hesitated to harden their stance on the border dispute. As the resolution of the dispute remains unclear, China and India have begun to intensify the discussion of risk hedging by creating more buffer zones between their militaries and strengthening crisis management mechanisms. There was also discussion of the need for the two sides to maintain regular political dialogue to smooth the growing rivalry in their relations. But India, with its ever-growing economy and its massive army of 1.4 million people, has decided to take its carefully planned steps to take on China, which it sees as a global risk factor. We will now take a closer look at how this crisis between India and China started, how India is trying to sideline China, and how this situation is reflected in the global economic and political arena. But before that, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. The China-India border along the Himalayas is the longest disputed border in the world. India is taking action to defend its rights in this dispute. The first area is military and economic dynamics. India's growing geopolitical influence is largely based on the hope that it can balance China's power. This makes the modernization of India's armed forces the second largest force of any country, with 1.4 million full-time personnel, a matter of global interest. According to the Global Firepower Index, a platform that analyzes data based on factors that determine a country's combat capability, India ranked as the world's fourth most powerful military, just behind China. India is the fifth largest economy and spends 13% of its annual budget on defense. In the fiscal year 2023-2024, India allocated $73.9 billion for defense, According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, India's defence spending has already increased by 50% in 10 years, from $49.6 billion in 2011 to $80 billion last year. With this defence budget, India has planned its military in a significant and incremental way. In terms of air power, India is not bad at all. India has 270 fighter jets positioned in different commands to counter China. Ignoring the difference in position, Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force jets are not positioned close to the border, and for any offensive operation, the jets have to choose between fuel or payload for long sorties due to the long combat radius. The downing of a Pakistani F-16 by an Indian MiG-21 in 2019 was one of the most significant incidents demonstrating the combat capability of an IAF pilot. As for the Navy, India has a fleet strength of 204 with 18 submarines. India and China are offshore navies, meaning they can operate globally with aircraft carriers. Both countries aim to defend the sea links of communications in the Indian Ocean region. The Quad alliance between India, Australia, the US and Japan aims at the safety and security of the Indo-Pacific region. This increases India's military power against China. This is because the naval power of countries like Australia, the US and Japan has the potential to seriously overwhelm the Chinese Navy. It is also estimated that India possesses 172 nuclear weapons. Compared to China, all this military power is capable of intimidating the Beijing regime and distracting it from the possibility of such a war, even if it would not bring a complete victory in the event of a war. In fact, with military support from India's allies, China may even decide to withdraw from such a confrontation in Asia altogether. India is not only confronting China with its own military economic power and the support of its allies, but is also trying to bring the Beijing regime to its knees through critical decisions. In this regard, New Delhi has banned domestic military drone manufacturers from using Chinese-made components. The government's decision comes after relations between the two nuclear-armed Asian neighbours have soured in recent years over long-standing territorial disputes along the line of actual control. Experts report that New Delhi's measure was implemented through military tenders, excluding equipment or subcomponents from countries that share land borders with India. The government's decision could further harden relations between the two nuclear-armed Asian neighbours. The last direct conflict between India and China dates back to December 2022, when hundreds of Indian and Chinese forces clashed along the border. Neither side used firearms and no casualties were reported. Nevertheless, several soldiers were injured on both sides. It was the worst clash since 2020, when 4 Chinese and 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives. The growing tensions between the two countries have fueled mutual distrust. Before the recent ban on Chinese components for military drones, the Indian government had implemented measures aimed at reducing risks from Beijing. For example, India banned 59 Chinese apps and imposed moderate restrictions on the import of Chinese drones. The new measure is a step forward. India wants to pursue a strategy of risk mitigation from China, and the ban on Chinese-made military drone components follows this path. However, facts on the ground show that achieving this goal in practice is very complicated. To date, China's big lab still seems indispensable for India's ambitions. So when did this violent crisis between the two countries begin? When did India set its mind on finishing China? It's time to take a journey into the depths of history. The last 7 decades have strained relations between two Asian giants, China and India. The border between Asia's two giant countries has been bleeding for decades. There is no officially defined border that everyone agrees on. Instead, there is an undefined area called the Line of Actual Control, also called escalates. Both sides have different views on where the line runs. China says it is a 2,000-kilometre line, while India says it is 3,488 kilometres. The divide is particularly sharp in the western and eastern sectors. In the west, India claims the 38,000 square kilometres of Aksai China, currently occupied by China, as its territory. In the east, India claims all of Arunachal Pradesh, while China calls it southern Tibet and claims 90,000 square kilometers. The existence of such a long, undefined border inevitably leads to sporadic military tensions, horrific conflicts, mutual occupations, and diplomatic crises. In fact, Beijing first officially raised Escalating in 1959. It was only in 1993 that India accepted it as an interim management of the border dispute. Although a series of bilateral agreements were signed, the two countries could not agree on the exact points at which the Escalating crosses. This is the root cause of tension between the two capitals for the last 7 decades. Areas like Ladakh, where Pakistan and China meet, and Arunachal Pradesh in the east have always been in dispute. India relies on the Simla Convention of 1914, arguing that the line is the Mac-Mahon line. China, on the other hand, rejects it on the grounds that Tibet has no sovereign jurisdiction. There are relatively few disputes in the central sector, but there can be minor frictions there too. At the end of the day, there are two giants. The common borderline is mountainous, snow-covered, and not at all clear. At every patrol contact, the claim is made that you have entered our territory and tensions can flare. To understand today's picture, one needs to look at history. For centuries, Tibet was a buffer zone between India and China in Asia. When the People's Republic of China formally occupied Tibet in 1950, a land border of thousands of kilometres was created. The British Empire had left behind no clearly drawn maps, and Beijing had not accepted any colonial treaty. The two new states were therefore left with a major dispute in the middle. In the early 1950s, both dreamed of Asian solidarity against colonialism. India was one of the first Asian countries to recognise the People's Republic of China and supported Beijing's seat in the United Nations. But two issues quickly emerged. The first was Tibet and the second was the border. In 1959, the Dalai Lama was forced to seek refuge in India as the Tibetan uprising was bloodily crushed. New Delhi welcomed thousands of Tibetan refugees. This angered Beijing. China lashed out at India for claiming the border and inciting rebellion in Tibet. Thus, mutual trust gradually disappeared. The short but violent war that broke out in 1962 was a disaster. India had set up patrols in the west and east as part of a so-called forward policy aimed at gaining position. China was uncomfortable with this. In October 1962, Chinese troops caught India off guard and dispersed the Indian army in just a few weeks. It then declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew, but Aksai held China. The battle resulted in 1,383 Indian casualties, 3,968 prisoners, and 1,696 casualties, 722 dead, and 1,697 wounded were reported on the Chinese side. This bitter experience reinforced in Beijing's mind the idea that, if we keep pressure on India on the border, we will deter their aggression. It had a traumatic effect on India and hardened its security policy. Small-scale clashes recurred in the 1970s and 1980s, but in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the two countries made an effort at rapprochement. Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and Chinese leaders exchanged visits. In 1993, an agreement called Maintenance of Peace and Tranquility along the line of actual control was signed. India and China established a modus vivendi, albeit superficially. Let us postpone the border dispute, cooperate in trade and diplomacy, and not freeze relations altogether. But over the years, nationalist sentiments and strategic goals have come to dominate in both countries. As China became a world giant with a rapidly growing economy, India moved closer to the United States and the West on its own development path. In Beijing's eyes, this reinforced the perception of India as the United States' partner in Asia. From the 2 millennia onwards, Beijing began to conduct more aggressive patrols over Escalating. China's border violations have increased, New Delhi complained. In Arunachal Pradesh, in the Tawang region, China stepped up its expansionist rhetoric. India responded by building border roads and outposts. Efforts to clarify Escalating have been in a constant stalemate, with the parties unable to even finalise map sharing. The 2013 Depsang incident in Ladakh was one of the biggest border crises of the 21st century. Chinese troops infiltrated and camped 19 kilometers inside the line that India considers escalates. When India reacted, China said, "We are already on our own territory." Eventually, India agreed to demolish some of its forward installations, and China withdrew. But this deepened the mistrust on both sides. New tensions erupted, such as the Doklam crisis in 2017 and the Galwan Valley in 2020. Each was marked by images of bloody or stick-and-fist clashes between soldiers of the two countries. Beijing and New Delhi say, "Let's keep the peace after each escalation," but the underlying rivalry never subsides. Today, tensions between India and China are seen as a reflection of Asia's great power competition. Both countries' position in the world market, military capacity, and nuclear power make the world watch the border clashes with concern. Especially on the high plateaus of the Himalayan mountains, patrols often come face to face, setting the stage for accidental or deliberate provocations. While China is using its close ties with Pakistan to corner India, India is strengthening its QUAD-like partnerships with the United States, Japan, and Australia. In recent years, with major infrastructure projects and trade corridors, LSA has gone from being just a mountainous landscape to being at the centre of global geopolitics. Years of agreements, joint working groups, special envoys, none have succeeded in reaching a permanent demarcation line. In fact, there is a land swap proposal that has been talked about since 1960. China would give up its claim to Arunachal Pradesh, and India would give up its claim to Aksai Chin. But India refuses and says, "The McMahon line is valid. There is an agreement with Tibet dated 1914. China repeats, "This agreement is not valid. Tibet was not authorized to sign it." Unless this key point is resolved, it seems impossible to clarify escalating. Both sides are strengthening their military strategies. The region remains tense and has the potential for some of the world's most high-altitude conflicts. So what is the future of the frictions? According to experts, the conflict on the border will continue at a low level but will not escalate into a major war. Nevertheless, the example of 1962 is still haunting. Both countries have nuclear power and large armies. Although they are not economically dependent on each other, the world market is too fragile to bear the cost of such a conflict in Asia. India, with its growing national pride and potential for cooperation with the West, aims to stand up to Beijing. China, on the other hand, wants to keep India passive in its intense competition with the United States. In this equation, it is not known when the LSE crisis will erupt and whether it will escalate into a major war. But the indisputable fact is that the two Asian giants de facto share an indeterminate border of hundreds of kilometers. There is great mistrust between them, and they have little choice but to manage it through diplomacy. As a result, the LSA dispute between India and China is not just a simple territorial issue, but an amalgam of the colonial legacy of the 20th century, the challenges of Himalayan geography, the depth of the Tibet issue, and the rising nationalist politics of both countries. These historical frictions escalated into war in 1962, escalated again at Depsang in 2013, Doklam in 2017, and Galwan in 2020. Nevertheless, both countries prefer not to completely sever relations because of the magnitude of their interests. While the delimitation of LHA is an equation that no one can solve in the short term, conflicts can perhaps be peacefully contained. How much depends on the strategic decisions taken by the two Asian giants and how the world order is shaped. The way the Xi and Modi administrations have used force at home and abroad, each more assertive than its predecessor, has reinforced the need to project military power along the border to discourage adventurism. What do you think? Can this deep historical and geographical dispute be resolved in the near future? Or will we see a cold tension with small skirmishes that will continue over time? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.